Hi, I'm Chef Franklin Becker. You know the jingle. Now discover the facts about Ozempic, a GLP-1. There's only one FDA-approved Ozempic made by Novo Nordisk. Learn about the real thing.
Talk to your healthcare professional today. Call 1-833-OZEMPIC or visit Ozempic.com to view the medication guide and to learn more about Ozempic. Semaglutide injection 0.5 milligram, 1 milligram, and 2 milligrams.
In the last episode, you heard the prosecution's story. 5 teenagers accused of robbing and murdering 61-year-old Nathaniel Jones. 5 young men, 1 brutal crime, and a trail of confessions the state said told it all. But what if the story you heard wasn't the whole truth? In a courtroom, every defendant begins with one powerful advantage, the presumption of innocence. But what happens when jurors hear the defendant's own words admitting guilt? Not just one of them pointing fingers at the others, but all 5 defendants and the friend who was with them that night. Is it possible to convince a jury that 6 people confessed to something that isn't true? The confessions read aloud in court seem to cause an invisible shift in the burden of proof. According to the defense, those confessions, drawn out from teens who had spent hours in cinder block rooms, revealed that it wasn't guilt, but pure exhaustion, intimidation, and the desperate hope of freedom that created the narratives that landed them in court. The defense argued that false confessions aren't rare, they're misunderstood. They don't always come from violence or threats. Sometimes they come from suggestions, isolation, and being questioned for hours, until the lines between truth and survival blur. The question at the center of this case isn't just who killed Nathaniel Jones. It's how 5 kids ended up confessing to it. With their clients' lives on the line, the defense was ready to fight back and show jurors a different story about what really happened and what didn't. They had evidence, transcripts, and the courage to challenge the one thing juries are taught to trust above all else, a confession. The prosecution says they were looking for an easy target. The defense says they were the targets. But it's the jurors who have the final say. This is 13th Juror Podcast, where we break down real court cases and put you in the juror's seat. 2 sides, the same evidence. You decide what to believe. I'm your host, Brandy Churchwell. Today's episode is North Carolina versus the Winston-Salem 5. Part 2, the defense. When it was time for the defense to begin, they were ready to tell jurors a very different story from the one they just heard. But there were some things they didn't dispute. They agreed that the evidence showed Nathaniel Jones left his service station a little after 6 o'clock on the evening of November 15th, 2002. He drove his nephew Terry home after stopping by the store and arrived at his house sometime around 6:30. Not long after, he was attacked, bound, gagged, and left to die, alone in the dark on the cold concrete floor of his own carport. The defense agreed this was a senseless tragedy. They also agreed the boys were with Jessica Black that night, went to the bowling alley, and that they went to Bellevue Park later that evening, after police had already arrived on scene. What they denied was that the 5 teenagers had anything to do with the death of Nathaniel Jones. Unlike some cases, the defense didn't present a completely different version of what happened. Because the truth is, and what the defense admitted, is that they don't know what happened. Their version of events that turns this case upside down isn't about the crime itself. It's about what happened after. To really understand the defense's case, we have to go back to where they say it all began, inside the small, windowless interrogation rooms of the Winston-Salem Police Department. This is where 5 frightened teenage boys became the Winston-Salem 5. Based on the testimony and evidence they presented, this is the defense's story. The state's case was built on 6 confessions. But to the defense, the circumstances by which these confessions were obtained were the clearest sign that something had gone terribly wrong. These were words written on police stationery in the middle of the night by children who didn't understand the weight of what they were signing. Studies have shown that juveniles are far more likely to falsely confess than adults, not because they're guilty, but because they're scared. And in this case, fear changed everything. These boys weren't hardened criminals. They were frightened kids who broke under pressure after hours of questioning. They were teenagers, without their parents or lawyers, alone with detectives who told them the others had already confessed, and that the only way to go home was to tell the truth. What happened inside those interrogation rooms wasn't justice. It was desperation. Police were under immense pressure to solve the murder of a well-known and respected man. 4 days had passed with no leads, and according to the defense, detectives stopped looking for the truth and started looking for someone to blame. Their desperation to close the case collided with the boys' desperation to end the questioning. And in that collision, the confessions were born. The defense attorneys knew the challenge they faced. False confessions are hard for juries to believe. After all, why would anyone admit to something they didn't do? The lawyers for Rayshawn and Nathaniel tried to call an expert witness to answer that very question. Someone who could explain to jurors how and why false confessions happen, and why kids are especially vulnerable to them. But prosecutors objected, arguing the jury didn't need an expert to tell them whether a confession was believable. The judge agreed. Without that testimony, the defense had to help jurors understand it themselves, starting with a phone call from a worried mother. It was November 19th, 2002, 4 days after the murder, when Detective Rose received a call from the mother of 15-year-old Jamal Tolliver. She told police her son had been acting strangely since the night of the killing. Quiet, withdrawn, and not himself. Detectives went to the Tolliver home that afternoon and asked Jamal to come to the station to talk. He agreed. Inside a small interrogation room, 2 armed detectives sat across from him and said his name had come up in their investigation. They wanted to know what he knew. Jamal denied everything. He even gave them an alibi. But as the hours passed, the questions got tougher, the tone sharper, and the pressure heavier. The defense said that's when things began to break down. Jamal was 15. He had only completed 7th grade and wasn't in school at the time the murder happened. In that room with the detectives, Jamal was alone, scared, and outmatched. He didn't have a lawyer or a parent present. He didn't know that he was allowed to walk out at any time. He repeatedly denied involvement, but detectives angrily told him they didn't believe him. When he protested, they told him he better make a statement. Detectives began asking about the friends he was with that night: Nathaniel, Rayshawn, Darrell, and Christopher. Jamal admitted he'd been with them, but that they went to the bowling alley in the park, not to commit a murder. With this connection established, detectives then started bringing in the others one by one. From that point on, police weren't listening for the truth or gathering information. They were building the story they wanted to hear, which was evident from their own notes. One detective wrote that Darrell Brayboy was unremorseful, and he underlined it. Another said Nathaniel was belligerent and had a chip on his shoulder. When a defense attorney asked whether it was possible that Nathaniel was angry because he was being falsely accused, the detective said, no, that wasn't a possibility. The defense argued that investigators used psychological tactics that were proven to break down adults, like telling each of them the others had already confessed, and that if they didn't cooperate, they'd never see their families again. If they just told the truth, or what detectives believed was the truth, they could go home. Each boy was placed in a small room with a visibly armed detective positioned in front of the door. They were called liars, yelled at, and threatened. One detective even pointed to his own arm and said, "That's where the lethal injection's going to go if you don't tell the truth." None of these kids knew they were too young for the death penalty. and none knew the police weren't being truthful. On the stand, one detective admitted he never told any of them their rights because he wasn't required to. Since they weren't technically under arrest, he said he didn't have to tell them that they could leave, remain silent, or call their parents. The defense argued that police delayed detaining them on purpose just so they wouldn't have to tell them their rights. As each boy was questioned, they all insisted they were innocent. But the hours dragged on, and slowly they began to crack. A word here, a detail there, met with approval and encouragement from detectives. Eventually, one by one, they all said the words detectives were looking for. Not because they were guilty, but because they believed that was the only way to make it stop. The result? 6 different statements taken over the course of one very long night. Each one slightly different. When the defense began to dissect the so-called confessions, they said it didn't take long for the cracks to show. Each statement was built on the same foundation. Hours of unrecorded interrogation followed by a single, seemingly coached confession. The problem? None of the early hours were documented. There were no notes from the first rounds of questioning or recordings of what detectives said before the tape began rolling. The only parts preserved were the final moments, the confessions themselves, written or recorded after the suspects had already been in those rooms for many hours. One attorney pressed a detective on this during cross-examination, asking, "We don't know what promises were made, what threats were used, what was said before the confessions began?" The detective paused before responding, "No, we don't." Another detective was asked about the recordings themselves. He confirmed that none of the suspects' interviews were taped in full, only the final statements, the ones that prosecutors later called confessions. The defense used those answers to draw a simple, devastating picture. Jurors had heard only the end of the story, not the hours of fear, confusion, and pressure that came before. Then came the inconsistencies. When each defendant's statement from their interrogations were compared, nothing made sense. Their statements, evidence, even basic facts about the crime scene did not match. When asked where the attack happened, the boys gave different answers. One said the victim, Nathaniel Jones, was inside the house. Another said he was in the driveway. When asked where he was left, one boy said Mr. Jones was left lying on his back in the grass. Another claimed he was dragged to a ditch. A third pointed to the driveway in front of the van, the same spot where first responders later moved Mr. Jones. The defense argued that this was the only position that boy ever saw, since he had only arrived after police were already there. None of them placed Jones where he actually was found, under the carport. The group was also asked about what weapons were used. One said a baseball bat, another said a stick. Another couldn't say what was used at all. The medical examiner testified that the injuries to Jones weren't consistent with a bat, and the bat police tested showed no traces of blood or DNA. No sticks or objects that could match any of the defendant's stories were found in the yard either. Detectives asked why the light was off in the carport. Answers ranged from someone turned off the light to they shut off the power to no lights were ever on. It wasn't until Rayshawn was specifically asked about unscrewing the bulb that the narrative shifted. And even then, he claimed a chair was used to reach it, which makes little sense if Jones' car was parked beneath it. Despite the prosecution pointing to a shoe print on the hood of the car, the bulb itself, when tested, showed no fingerprints matching any of the 5 boys or Jessica Black. The teens were asked what Mr. Jones was driving. One thought it was a van. Another didn't think there was a car in the carport at all. Both were wrong. The defense's refrain was simple. These weren't 5 versions of the same story. They were 5 stories written under the same pressure, full of guesses meant to fill in the blanks. And the little physical evidence that existed wasn't enough to fill those gaps. The interrogations produced no new facts for the detectives. To the defense, that was the clearest sign of all. These weren't real confessions. They were echoes of the investigators' theory. The defense called Christopher's sister, Shamika, to testify as an alibi witness. Shamika told the jury that Christopher was at home with her on the night of November 15th, when Nathaniel Jones was killed. She recalled seeing him at the house around the time the prosecution alleged the murder occurred, and said she knows he was there because he was helping babysit her young son while she was sick. Shamika said Christopher didn't leave again until later that evening, when Jessica Black dropped by briefly. And what about Jessica Black? The state's star witness, the only one who placed the boys in the area of Mr. Jones' house that night. The defense argued that her story didn't add up. They pointed out inconsistencies between what she told detectives in her first interview and what she later said in court. In a statement, she placed some of the boys at the Dollar General store, but during trial, she admitted that Jamal wasn't even there. She told police the group talked about jacking someone up, but under cross-examination, she said those comments were just jokes, not a real plan. During an intense cross, Jessica broke down in tears. The judge had to excuse the jury so she could compose herself. When they returned, she admitted she'd been scared when she talked to detectives. She said the officers yelled at her, accused her of lying, and even told her she could be charged as an accessory to murder if she didn't cooperate. One officer, she said, slammed his hand on the table and shouted, "This is bullshit." He yelled so aggressively, Jessica said he was spitting on her. She admitted she felt pressured, intimidated, and believed she might avoid charges if she cooperated. The defense seized on that, telling jurors that Jessica was never charged, despite admitting she drove the boys that night and helped them after the crime. They argued that her fear and self-preservation shaped every word she told investigators. And although she never said she made it all up, her evolving story, from silver duct tape to black electrical tape, from who was in the car to who wasn't, showed just how easily a scared teenager could bend under police pressure. Jessica Black wasn't a reliable witness. She was a frightened 16-year-old girl trying to say what detectives wanted to hear. The same kind of pressure that broke the 5 boys sitting at the defense table. Still, prosecutors called those statements the heart of their case, the confessions that tied it all together. To the defense, however, they were stories that had been fed, shaped, and recorded at the end of a very long night. And because words can be twisted, memories bent, and fear, especially in the mind of a child, can make fiction sound like fact, the defense asked jurors to put the statements aside and look at something that doesn't lie: the physical evidence.
My uncontrollable movements, called TD, tardive dyskinesia, felt embarrassing. I felt like disconnecting. I asked my doctor about treating my TD and learned about Ingrezza, a prescription medicine clinically proven for reducing TD in adults. That's always 1 capsule, once daily, and number 1 prescribed. People taking Ingrezza can stay on most mental health meds.
Ingrezza can cause depression, suicidal thoughts, or actions in patients with Huntington's disease. Call your doctor if you become depressed, have sudden behavior or mood changes, or suicidal thoughts. Don't take Ingrezza if allergic. Serious side effects may include allergic reactions like sudden, potentially fatal swelling and hives, sleepiness, the most common side effect, and heart rhythm problems. Know how Ingrezza affects you before operating a car or dangerous machinery. Report fever, stiff muscles, or problems thinking, as these might be life-threatening. Shaking, stiffness, drooling, and trouble with moving or balance may occur.
Take control by asking your doctor about Ingrezza.
Learn more at Ingrezza.com. That's INGREZZA.com.
Nothing brings us together like Eggland's best eggs. Always so fresh and delicious, plus superior nutrition like 6 times more vitamin D, 10 times more vitamin E, and 25% less saturated fat compared to ordinary eggs. For us, it's eggs any style, as long as they're the best. Eggland's Best. Better taste, better nutrition, better eggs. Visit egglandsbest.com to learn more.
After spending days dissecting the defendant's statements, the defense turned to evidence that is supposedly unshakable, the kind that lives in fingerprints, fibers, and blood. Because if the truth lived anywhere in this case, the defense said it would be there. Physical evidence is any tangible item that can be observed and analyzed. For example, biological evidence like DNA, trace evidence like hair, impression evidence like fingerprints or shoe prints, and digital evidence like video surveillance footage. In any criminal case, physical evidence should be the anchor, the part of the story that doesn't change with time or memory. It's what separates a confession from a conviction, and what turns speculation into proof. If the confessions were as unreliable as the defense claimed, then the truth had to live in the physical evidence. And when the defense began walking jurors through it piece by piece, the state's story unraveled, starting with the tape. The state had claimed the boys bought black tape from a local store before the murder. It was part of star witness Jessica Black's testimony. Investigators on the case checked for video footage from both stores that Jessica said the group went to, Maxway and Dollar General. They watched hours of footage, and not one piece of footage exists of the defendants ever entering that store. No clerk remembered them, and there's no receipt. What's even more concerning is that investigators also checked to see if either store sold the type or brand of tape that was used on Mr. Jones. And neither did. The tape itself was tested for fingerprints, but no identifiable prints were noted or developed. Investigators were able to get a total of 12 fingerprints from Mr. Jones' car, none of which matched the defendants. Clothing and shoes were collected from each of the defendants' homes. A total of 8 pairs of shoes, 5 pairs of pants, 5 shirts, 1 jacket, and 1 hat. Every single one of them was tested for blood, given the brutal nature of the attack. The result? No trace of blood was found on any of the boys' items. The seat covers from Jessica's car were also tested. Again, no presence of blood. And just as telling, no DNA from Mr. Jones was ever found in Jessica Black's car or on anything that belonged to the boys. The alleged weapons? None were ever found. Not a single object that could explain the injuries. And despite the violence prosecutors described, no one reported hearing a struggle, a scream, or a cry for help. The only person who said she heard anything that night was Jessica Black, the same witness whose testimony formed the backbone of the state's case. Even the footprint, the one prosecutors said tied the boys to the scene, was far from conclusive. The analyst admitted the Air Force One tread pattern was common, not unique, and could have matched any number of shoes in the area. The only thing they were able to say with certainty is that the print could have come from one of the shoes, or any other shoe that has similar size and design. The blood patterns around Mr. Jones' body proved nothing either. A forensic expert testified that those patterns indicated he had been moved after the initial bleeding began, a detail that directly undercut the state's fixed timeline of events. So, was this a robbery gone wrong? According to the defense, common sense can tell you it wasn't. Mr. Jones had nearly $1,000 in his pocket that wasn't taken, and his briefcase in the trunk of the car had even more, although his wallet was never located by investigators. The defense argued that if the state's story was true, the science would have supported it, but it didn't. Just 5 inconsistent statements and a pile of evidence that didn't point to anyone at all. The prosecution said the evidence proved their case. The defense said the evidence proved there was no case. After the defense showed what wasn't there, they focused on what was. Other voices, cars, and shadows moving through the neighborhood the night Nathaniel Jones was killed. Witnesses said they saw people, but not the boys on the stand. If those accounts were true, it meant someone else was out there that police hadn't found. The first was Ava Williams. Ava had known Mr. Jones for years. She saw him as a father figure and even called him Dad. On the evening of November 15th, sometime between 6:15 and 6:30 p.m., she drove past his house on Moravia Street. His Lincoln was parked under the carport, its brake lights glowing red. She slowed down. Behind the wheel, she said, sat a short black man. She could tell immediately it wasn't Mr. Jones. This man's head barely reached the top of the headrest. His build was different, smaller. She didn't see anyone else, and at the time assumed it was one of Mr. Jones' grandsons, only later realizing it couldn't have been. Then came the two kids on bicycles. One of them, 12-year-old B.J. Lowry, told investigators he was riding near the park when his chain came off. As he stopped to fix it, his friend pointed toward Mr. Jones' yard. B.J. looked up just in time to see a man leap over a rock and run toward the park. He described the man as dark-skinned, wearing black pants, a black shirt, and a toboggan or hoodie. He said the man was tall, but when asked to compare, he said, "About my sister's height." His sister was 5'4". He wasn't sure of the exact time, but he remembered the lights at the recreation center had just gone off, which meant it was sometime after 6 o'clock. Then there was a cab dispatcher who worked for Willard's Cab Company. He testified that on the night of November 15th, he received several calls requesting a pickup at 905 Moravia Street, the home of Nathaniel Jones. He said the calls came in between 6 and 8 p.m., 4 separate calls in a 15 to 20-minute window. The man requesting the cab grew impatient, asking where the car was and why it hadn't come yet. Eventually, a driver was sent, but when he arrived, no one came outside. The next day, the dispatcher saw the murder on the news and immediately called police. The address was the same one he'd been hearing over and over the night before. The defense emphasized that every one of these statements, Ava Williams' sighting, B.J. Lowry's account, and the cab company's records, were all given to police within days of the murder, and each one was disregarded. Why? They didn't fit the theory or match the confessions, so they were quietly ignored. Therein lies the tragedy in the tragedy. An investigation, built on words instead of physical evidence, blinded detectives to every possibility that didn't fit their story. The real killer might have walked right past the flashing lights that night, while 5 frightened kids sat in interrogation rooms confessing to a crime they didn't commit. Among the 5 teenagers accused, only one took the stand in his own defense, Darrell Brayboy. He had just turned 15 a few weeks before his arrest. During his testimony, Darrell described his movements on November 15, 2002, a version that painted a completely different picture from the one prosecutors told. He said that around 3:30 p.m., his mother dropped him off at Christopher's house. There, he saw Jamal and later Rayshawn walked over. Not long after, Jessica Black arrived, driving with Nathaniel Cauthen. According to Darrell, they spent part of the evening hanging out, first at Bellevue Park, then at a nearby Servco gas station, and later at Jed's grandmother's house before heading back to Christopher's. Around 7:30 or 8 p.m., Christopher, Jamal, Nathaniel, and Darrell went to the Creekside bowling alley. They were only there for about half an hour. Afterward, they went back to Christopher's house, then rode to Midway with Jessica to meet one of her friends. The friend wasn't home when they arrived, so the group headed back to Winston-Salem around 8:30 or 9. Jamal went home. Darrell and Christopher went back to Christopher's house for the night. And Darrell insisted he never went near Moravia Street or Nathaniel Jones' home that night. He also described what happened 4 days later, when detectives confronted him at the hospital, where his mother had just had surgery. He said they asked him to come to the station, and he agreed. Once there, he was placed in a small room, alone, for hours. Detectives came in and out, feeding him details and insisting he come clean. At one point, 2 officers leaned in close and accused him of lying. They pointed to a vein in their arms and said that's where the needle would go if he didn't give them the answers they wanted. Terrified and exhausted after nearly 5 hours of questioning, Darrell said he eventually just repeated back what the investigators had been telling him all along, a story they'd already decided was true. His confession wasn't recorded until 10:21 p.m., more than 5 hours after the interrogation began. Darrell's words weren't a confession at all. They were the product of threats, fear, and the kind of psychological pressure no 15-year-old should ever face. In the end, the defense told the jury that what wasn't found spoke louder than anything that was. No fingerprints, DNA, blood, weapon, or proof. Just 5 frightened boys and a story built on words that changed every time they were told. The state gave the jury a story built on confessions, a shoe print, and theories. The defense gave them doubt. Doubt about the evidence, the investigation, and about whether justice had been served or simply manufactured. They reminded the jurors that their duty wasn't to solve the crime. It was to decide whether the state had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. And even if one unanswered question remained, one inconsistency, one detail that didn't fit, then the law demanded only one verdict. The defense attorney stood before the jury and asked them to look not at what they'd been told, but at what they'd seen. And more importantly, what they hadn't. 5 children sat at the defense table, their lives hanging on words they never should have had to defend in the first place. Now, it was in the hands of the jurors, who had to question not only guilt or innocence, but also overall trust in the system, in the police, and in the words we choose to believe.
Did my card go through?
Oh no.
Your small business depends on its internet, so switch to Verizon Business. And you can get LTE business internet starting at $39 a month when paired with select business mobile plans. That's unlimited data for unlimited business.
There we go.
Get the internet you need at the price you want. Verizon Business. Starting price for LTE business internet, 25 megabits per second unlimited data plan with select Verizon Business smartphone plan savings. Terms apply.
For your tushy, it's made by angels, soft and strong, budget friendly. The choice is simple, a roll that feels like paradise, and always at a heavenly price. Angel soft, soft and strong, so it's simple.
Pick up a pack today.
Angel soft, soft and strong, simple.
The lawyer sat down. The exhibits were packed away. All that was left were strangers in a jury box with the weight of 5 young lives in their hands. The silence in the courtroom was the sound of judgment waiting to be spoken. The trial of Rayshawn Banner and Nathaniel Cawthon began on August 9th, 2004. 10 days later, on August 19th, the jury returned with unanimous verdicts after just 1 hour and 23 minutes of deliberation. The jurors filed back into their seats. The brothers, Rayshawn and Nathaniel, sat at the defense table, their mother watching from the gallery behind them. One by one, the clerk read the verdicts aloud. Rayshawn Banner, guilty of first-degree murder and robbery with a dangerous weapon. His brother, Nathaniel Cawthon, guilty on the same counts. The remaining defendants, Jamal Tolliver, Jarrell Brayboy, and Christopher Bryant, were tried the following year on the lesser charges of second-degree murder and common law robbery. Their trial began on May 9th, 2005. After 2.5 days of deliberation, the jury returned their verdicts on May 20th. One by one, the verdict slips were read aloud. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Before sentencing in the first trial, prosecutors read a letter written by Chris Paul, Nathaniel Jones' grandson, titled An Unexpected Best Friend. In it, Chris wrote that most people's best friends are classmates, teammates, or next-door neighbors, but not his. His best friend was the heart and soul of his family, his grandfather, Nathaniel Jones. Standing at 6 foot 2 inches tall, Mr. Jones was a man to be feared, Chris wrote. Not because he was dangerous, but because he could kill you with his charm and kindness. He described how his grandfather taught him to be strong, to hold on, and to never let anyone tell him he was too short, too small, or too dark to achieve his dreams. He recalled the day he signed his letter of intent to play basketball for Wake Forest University, the pride in his grandfather's smile, and how he thought that moment would last forever. But just 24 hours later, his best friend was gone. When it was his turn to speak, Nathaniel Cawthon stood before the judge. His voice shook as he said he'd already spent 2 years of his life behind bars for something he didn't do. And now he was being sentenced for something he still swore he hadn't done. I'm sorry this man lost his life, he said. But I didn't have anything to do with it. This isn't right. This isn't justice. Then came the judge's words, stern, deliberate, and unforgettable. He called it a picture of cold conspirators up to no good, a criminal enterprise going out in the night to seek prey. He said Nathaniel Jones' blood was forever on their hands. A wild animal in the field, he told them, would have shown more respect for human life than this. He said he seldom in his many years seen less willingness to accept responsibility or more resistance to showing remorse. And then he pronounced the sentences. Christopher Bryant, Darrell Brayboy, and Jamal Tolliver each sentenced to 13 to 16 and a half years for second-degree murder, plus an additional 13 to 16 months for the robbery, to be served consecutively. Rayshawn Banner and Nathaniel Cawthon sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge added that he would recommend they be assigned to hard labor. These individuals were only able to be children for the first 14 and 15 years of their lives. The rest will be spent in prison. For the state, justice had been served. For the families of the defendants, it felt like their world had ended. 5 teenagers were led away in handcuffs, their childhoods traded for a life behind bars. The gavel had fallen, but the story of the Winston-Salem 5 was far from over. Because the questions didn't stop when the verdict was read. Instead, they grew louder. How could 5 boys with no physical evidence against them be convicted of murder? How could 6 confessions, each one inconsistent, each one recanted, stand as proof beyond a reasonable doubt? And if the truth wasn't in that courtroom, where was it? Over the next 2 decades, those questions would unravel everything the jury thought they knew. Confessions would be challenged. Witnesses would recant. And the very system that convicted them would be forced to take another look. In the next episode of 13 Juror Podcast, we step beyond the jury box, into the years that followed, the fight for freedom, and the truth that refused to stay buried. Because sometimes, the verdict isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's the beginning.
My uncontrollable movements called TD, tardive dyskinesia, felt embarrassing. I felt like disconnecting. I asked my doctor about treating my TD and learned about Ingrezza, a prescription medicine clinically proven for reducing TD in adults. That's always 1 capsule, once daily, and number 1 prescribed. People taking Ingrezza can stay on most mental health meds.
Ingrezza can cause depression, suicidal thoughts, or actions in patients with Huntington's disease. Call your doctor if you become depressed, have sudden behavior or mood changes, or suicidal thoughts. Don't take Ingrezza if allergic. Serious side effects may include allergic reactions like sudden, potentially fatal swelling and hives, sleepiness, the most common side effect, and heart rhythm problems. Know how Ingrezza affects you before operating a car or dangerous machinery. Report fever, stiff muscles, or problems thinking, as these might be life-threatening. Shaking, stiffness, drooling, and trouble with moving or balance may occur.
Take control by asking your doctor about Ingrezza.
Learn more at Ingrezza.com. That's INGREZZA.com.
Did my card go through?
Oh no.
Your small business depends on its internet, so switch to Verizon Business. And you could get LTE business internet starting at $39 a month when paired with select business mobile plans. That's unlimited data for unlimited business.
There we go.
Get the internet you need at the price you want. Verizon Business. Starting price for LTE business internet, 25 megabits per second, unlimited data plan with select Verizon Business smartphone plan savings. Terms apply.